over the wireless that there was a typhoon down around Japan, where you go to between the islands to get out west or east. And I kept listening, and an American ship, which was taking home Russian refugees. You remember a number escaped out to Vladivostok, and we picked them up and brought them out to Europe. This American ship had a carload of these people, had anchored in the typhoon just at the entrance, and had gone on the rocks, dragged all the anchors and gone on the rocks, and was pounding up and down, and was sending out an SOS. And I started to answer, but immediately I was jammed by the Japanese. This probably had nothing to do with the story of development of radio here, of computers at MIT, but it's an interesting story, because the Japanese, during the war, they had waited, of course, until they knew that we were going to enter, and then they said, "Now look, all your shipping is needed out there in the Atlantic. Let us, the Japanese, handle the Pacific." And they developed their ships very fast, and were getting control of that, and were very angry when the American ships began to reappear. And that was the case in point. And this one had gone on the rocks, which was fine for them. But when I started to answer it, no, they jammed me. I was interviewed later on by somebody from the State Department about this whole affair, and it's a historical bit. Anyway, I knew where she was. We came down, the typhoon passed. She hadn't broken up yet, and we did our best we're going to try to get her off the rocks. And all of a sudden, everybody on the deck of our ship was thrown down flat because we had bumped. The sea was tremendous. We landed on the rocks ourselves. Well, fortunately, we were lifted off. We got away, but a good deal of damage was done. And it was some weeks before I got out of Japan. And when I got home, it was, as you know, too late for me to go to Stanford. So I went to the University of Washington, which was very, very good. And I guess I'm telling stories a little bit too long and not having to do with competition, but just show how fate enters into our lives. I sat next to in math class, next to a former classmate in high school I knew very well. And he and I used to talk together as to what we would do the next year. Both of us had ideas that we wanted to go somewhere. And we discussed Stanford, and we discussed Yale and various places. And one day, he came to me and he said, "I made up my mind, I know. I'm going to Boston Tech." And I said, well, I know where Boston is, but what's Boston Tech? And never had I heard before that of this institution. And it was just sheer chance that happened. Well, I got interested, and I wrote back and forth and decided to come. And they allowed me to come. And the next summer, I took another ship as operator down to the Panama Canal and up here in 1920, same time as you, I arrived. Except that I thought I was a sophomore, they thought I was a freshman, and you were a graduate student. And I will not take all the time to tell you how I overcame that difficulty and got through in 3 years. We have our 60th reunion next month. Well, then I took the electrical course. I was in course 6, of course. I knew Kenneth very well. I got to know this man better. One of the great privileges and advantages was to take the thesis under him, Jim Clapp, and it was still along those lines, vacuum tubes, and I got interested particularly in higher and shorter wavelengths. The amateurs, of course, at that time could do 200, The standard commercial was 600 meters. The amateurs were 200, and we were trying to get down into centimeters and so on. Well, that was the beginning of that period. So work with Wiener, with Kenneth, with Bush, and with Ed Bould, very, very much so. And I'll cut this off very quickly. I got still more and more interested in electromagnetic theory and electromagnetic waves and the propagation. And I took the courses that a lot of it was in physics, gave in electromagnetic theory. And then I got more and more interested in some of the new physics that was taking place. And, well, from the years 23, 24 after graduation, I was in France at Grenoble, from which I just came back a few days ago. But that didn't change anything. Then I decided that I really wanted to get into the physics, of this kind of physics, and get a doctorate degree. So I went to Zurich after weighing around. And it was that was 1926, and it was a great period for when there were so much was coming in physics, and so many great people. Peter Dubai was my thesis director, but I was in touch with, and they were examiners, with Hermann Weyl, the mathematician, Scherer, and Schrödinger particularly, who was down in the university on the wave theory of quantum mechanics. And that interested me particularly because I did some problems on scattering of hydrogen, scattering of Schrödinger waves by hydrogen atoms in the atmosphere or anywhere. And so a whole development and interest in the scattering and wave propagation problem that stayed with me. Well, I came back and went in the electrical engineering department with this fellow again, and but the two interests pulled on me. I took in due time. I began to teach the largest courses in electromagnetic theory there, and got more and more interested in the physics department. It was sort of divided between the two, and this was the period you were speaking of when the physics department didn't know where it was going. Mm-hmm. And then I worked with, about this time, with Ed, as he said, down at Round Hill. And the interesting thing then, as you were speaking of the fog, Green had a short runway for planes there, but they were very often it was hampered by the fog, and you couldn't get down. We were wondering how we could get around that, and I got to thinking, is it possible that a certain wavelength will be absorbed and will eradicate the fog? And so I spent about quite a little time what was really wave mechanics that I had taken to see if it applied to the real fog in the real atmosphere, just to show you how these things start and carry on. Well, we can talk about what happened later after some of these conversations, but from then on I went over to the physics department. But it was always the same interest, close ties with Ed and with the electrical engineering department, and that led up to the war, and then the research laboratory of electronics afterwards. Only one thing you didn't talk about was that as the war was going on and Britain was threatened, of course, they didn't have the time available to develop the shortwave radar. They had radar with longer waves, which would allow them to detect flights of German planes coming over in the daytime, but they could, or in the nighttime, but they couldn't, with those long waves, they couldn't locate them sufficiently accurately. And so they felt the dire necessity of getting very much shorter waves, centimeter waves, and getting radar which would focus directly on a single plane and allow it to be shot down. Well, we were working on thinking of that problem, but we had no means of producing short waves with sufficient power without having too much weight for an airplane to carry. And they, of course, developed the magnetron, and they came over to us to give us and to ask our help. Alfred Loomis was very much concerned in this. You and I went down to Tuxedo Park and saw his laboratory where he was working on these shortwave things and so on. And then there came the question of when the British brought us, to our surprise, the magnetron, who was going to work on that. And there was a committee, I'm skipping over the details, involving Jewett of the Bell Laboratories and Loomis.
Don't skip over the details. That's very important. Why not just take the time?
Well,
Just take another 5 minutes.
it's a long story, but there was a committee. See, Bush had already gone to Washington and was setting up his various committees to look at different things. And the committee to look at this was, I guess, who was the chairman? Was it Loomis?
Loomis.
That's what I thought. Alfred Loomis.
And I'm the secretary.
Yeah, and but Jewett and
Yes.
and several others, and of course there was somewhat of a struggle as to who knew that a laboratory had to be set up or to be given this job. And Jewett quite naturally said, "Well, the Bell Laboratories is already here and ready to do this," and there were various other just suggestions. But I think it was, I think Loomis was responsible.
And I was irresponsible.
And you were irresponsible for getting it to MIT.
Yeah. Which laboratory did they mean was already here? Loomis's or Bell Labs?
Bell Labs.
Bell Labs.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
I can add a note to that if you want.
Could I? Well,
You break in for
I
me.
just interject too that part of the decision was based on the fact that Bell Labs, although a regulated utility, was part of industry and competed with industry. And they felt it would be much better to have this laboratory dissociated from industry.
Right.
So it could deal with all.
Well, that's right.
Part of the research.
Yeah, I think so.
I'd like to break in if I
Right
may.
decision for the wrong reason.
I don't want to drag this on, but this is what Julius is talking about is so vital historically in my mind. The NDRC had a microwave committee. It was originally going to be a committee for investigating radar, or what became radar, really, and that is to detect above the surface of the water, and also to work on sonar or detection under the water.
Yep.
And our friends Vannevar Bush and Compton, in their own inimitable ways, I'll use the word again, got themselves into a little difficulty with the Navy, because the Navy was very sensitive about prying into their activities, especially civilians, and I suppose above all college professors or ex-professors. So they developed a little combat, a bit of contention And it was virtually a combat because Van Bush was a bit short-tempered and Carl was easily hurt. And that combination made it difficult to negotiate. And there was an Admiral Bowen who headed the Naval Research Lab, and I'll be damned if he was going to let these fellows get under the tent, even their nose. And so that delayed underwater sound, and Van in his eagerness, Bush in his eagerness to go ahead, got the Microwave Committee to limit itself to radar detection. I wanted to go back for just a moment, if I might. Julius mentioned Boston Tech. I come from the boondocks out in the Ozarks, or the foothills of the Ozarks, and I spent my young life following lower animals and my upper life trailing the upper ones with a certain satisfaction. But anyway, my father was a country doctor out there, horseback doctor, and wrote me a letter when I came here, addressed to Boston Tech. That was all that was on the envelope. I still have the letter. Came here to this general area, in other words, Boston. And zips, of course, were unknown. And I'll be damned if I didn't get that letter at MIT. That shows the position of MIT in the community in those days.
I heard about Boston Tech before Julius
I wouldn't be surprised.
did, 1917 or 18. And I didn't hear about MIT until a classmate of mine in high school came home for his Christmas vacation in 1930. And he called it MIT. It was Boston Tech.
Yeah, Boston Tech.
It was Boston Tech in Australia when I was writing in 1928.
Yeah. What I mean is, I hadn't heard of MIT.
Right.
I hadn't heard of anything.
By the way, if
I'd like to pick up for a moment on this conversation about the beginning of the radar of the RAD lab. How much and when did we know about what the British had done? At what point did they open up fully?
Tizard mission.
I think I can answer.
Go
It
ahead.
was
No.
in the summer of 1940
40,
when the Cockroft mission came over here
yes.
with a box full of components, not only radar, but they had jet engine blades, they had all kinds of stuff. Maybe computer stuff for all I know. And they turned it over freely.
That's
They
right.
just said, "We can't manage it, will you please help us?" There was no holdback on the part of the British that I have ever detected. There was an
No.
argument over the patent on the 10-centimeter magnetron after the war.
After the war, yeah.
But
But wasn't that
I can-
also about the same time that Zyke Barrow was using his propagation from horns? Because I worked with him out here in the court here,
Oh, yes.
using a searchlight mount and an amplidyne.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
when I came here in 37, Zyke had already begun that work
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, we were.
using Klystron.
That's right, yeah. Well, now, that was before the radiation laboratory
long.
Oh,
was
yeah.
formed.
I can throw a little light on this as long as we're having a discussion here. The Cockroft mission, I'm sorry, the Tizard mission,
Desert.
had Cockroft as one of the prime members, and at Loomis's place on Tuxedo Park, the Microwave Committee had revealed to it, that is, the NDRC Microwave Committee, the cavity magnetron that the British had developed, which, by the way, the French feel they had a foot in before British got to it. But
So did Percy Spencer at Raytheon.
well,
Yes.
He really did.
Yeah.
I can throw a little light on that too, if it's germane in a way. I wanted to say a word, compliment what Julius has said. The Microwave Committee had an idea that it wanted action, and Bush was a prime mover there because he was putting the blowtorch on us. And we were worried about submitting to the services. We felt that our job was to do what they weren't doing or to supplement. And so we decided that we'd put a laboratory in Washington and to try to keep peace in the family. In those days, the Army Air Corps was the Air Force of today. So, and it was beholden to the Army because it was a part of the Army. So there was one tangle. Then we had the Navy trying to build up air, witness having made some time before King, that formed the Bureau of Aeronautics and put Admiral King in charge as the first chief. They were trying to build the carrier idea and worried about Hap Arnold with his strategic air force that he was heralding. And they each one were competing for position while we were trying to get ready to fight a war. Now, we thought to putting the laboratory between the Naval Research Lab at Anacostia and an Army, it was, I can't remember the name of the point there in Washington, but get this, something in between to be neutral. And there's no worse way to get into a fight than trying to be neutral. And Loomis and I got to worrying about this and decided that MIT was the place, and I like to claim some credit for being biased. And we knew the story with Bell Labs because Bell had, during World War I, a laboratory right across from the West Street laboratory in which they were doing work for the services. So, I'm talking about Loomis and myself over a cocktail. That may not, you can delete the cocktail, but it was enjoyable. Wondering what the hell to do. And MIT, we agreed, was the place for the lab, but how do you do it? So we consulted one Vannevar Bush of necessity, and he said, if Carl Compton will approve. In other words, after all, we couldn't very well take over the Institute without his permission. And then the job was to worry about how to fend off Frank Jewett. And Jewett was on the main committee, the main NDRC committee. So, finding that Bush approved this, we now had the good fortune to find Carl Compton was in Washington. So we got a hold of Carl. Carl, if asked, like a proposal problem, would accept. So we had that cleared. Now what do we do with Jewett? Well, we had a kind of a rump session with Bush, and he got all of us together in his office there at the Carnegie Institute. Jewett, Loomis, Bush, Compton, myself. We were trying to work out a strategy, if I dare use a term like that. So Bush artfully posed a question of our confusion about the laboratory not being, in Washington, not being a place to put it. He agreed with that. And pretty soon Jewett piped up and said, well, you know, we're in World War I. We did a great job right across the street from Bell Labs, and there was an open invitation. Carl Compton spoke up mildly and said something about MIT, but it was clear that he'd like to have be willing to have the lab. And Jewett made the mistake of his life, and it really has a lot to do with how that lab came to MIT. He said, Carl, an educational institution, granted MIT is a place, you could have it, but they don't know anything about management. And poor old Carl, all you had to do is, he hurt his feelings. And he piped up and came not to the defense of the radiation lab, the potential laboratory, but the insult, you might say, or the offense Jewett had committed in claiming MIT didn't know anything about management. He allowed it was a fairly respectable establishment and had done a pretty good job. And then Jewett comes along with a fatal mistake. He said, well, Carl, don't misunderstand me. MIT is a wonderful place, and it has great facilities here, there, and elsewhere, you know, in space and what have you. Carl was appeased a little bit. Loomis spoke up with his usual acumen, said, well, Frank, I'm so glad you approve having the laboratory at the Institute. And Jewett was
That's Loomis, all right.
backed into a corner,